Hello everyone, today we talk about late Roman light cavalry, so something between the 3rd and the 6th century. In general, as this is an arm that is relatively scarcely documented, considering the importance of the heavier troops, and that figure less for a number of reasons. That is true a bit for all eras, all armies, and especially in the sedentary world, where essentially the attention is focused, in fact, on either on the bigger picture, which is naturally very, very helpful, and or sometimes towards the heavier troops. And here we should descend a bit into the literature to give a bit of background. But it is important to realize how varied in origin, but also relatively standard in practice and in function, such light cavalry was. Right? We see often this perspectival illusion, in a sense, for which we believe of how did all these various light cavalrymen differ from one another. Right? Well, what was a properly light, a Roman light cavalryman, and what was like a Hunnic or Moorish light cavalrymen that figured so in such large numbers in the Roman armies proper at the end of the day, because independently from the fact that there were mercenaries, they were often even hired on the spot sometimes, and there are also true private means that, especially in the latter phase of this period, is quite evident, were literally coming from another cultural background, right? Were paid properly were hired through, by the single commanders. Think about Belisarius and how, for example, these two ethnicities figured consistently in their armies, and how much also the Romans naturally fought against these people. So that, of course, in any of these situations, the hybrid is proven, among the other things, that whenever you found one of these foreign elements in the Roman army, you knew that they fought for and against the Romans as a military culture, and that the latter couldn't really be uninfluenced by it. But the function of light cavalry, tactically and strategically speaking, is always that one, right? You have these scouts, skirmishers, explorers, foragers that need to move fast, right? And to provide this screening for the army, literally both from a tactical and strategical point of view. There are also certain technical aspects, as we will see, relatively to the paths they had to follow because of the development in horseshoeing and so on, what these mounts were about, and so everything is functional to that wall that today we don't look at. So we will see most when talking tactics. Today we will read some passages that explain mostly skirmishing tactics, from which you can understand what fundamentally this deal was. It's important to stress how there's a bit of change over time. Like, if you start from the 3rd century, 4th century, you still have essentially an effective military machine supported by a bureaucracy and administration that actually grows in the first period. Then, especially with Diocletian, Constantine, becomes for roughly 1 century very well oiled, and even because the cost of it was definitely worth the tactical and strategic achievements of the Roman army during that period. Then eventually, from the late 4th century, we witness certain changes, right, that in the West will bring, as you know, in 1 century to the final collapse of the demographic and economical capabilities, so the army couldn't properly be levied anymore. In the East, to a gradual transformation that is said, normally, the West didn't make it, but in the East, after all, it was fine. Well, really not, right? There were still comparable dynamics, where not only you have all these foreign elements as properly, not just a military units, but literally as political agents that sometimes also properly troubled the internal policy. The troops by themselves, as foreigners, were not the problem in itself. The problem was how much political control you had on the army, which is, Clausewitsianly speaking, the point of this all. And therefore, when you arrive to this mostly happening in the 5th century, a bit like in the moment of crisis of the West. We made recently a video about, in manualistic Byzantine history, exactly that phase. So for the 6th century, when the imperial armies operate the big reconquest of the West, they keep operating on other fronts, mostly on the Balkan and in the eastern Persian frontier. You see that while this was definitely a moment of important expansion, right? The Roman Empire had proved it, but just by reconquering all those lands. But also this was a long, let's say, the consequence and the reward of a long-term process that had to do also with the reinforcement of a sort of thalassocratic policy, and indeed the fact that the East had survived as a more stable power, had managed to maintain control on its resources and on the frontiers and so on. You have you have something that is different from the, let's say, uniform army that you could see in Constantinian times, where independently from the presence of the foederati that had always been in every single Roman phase, the majority of the Roman army, let's say, or the majority of the as auxiliaries, as allies of the troops the Romans commanded. So independently from any consideration on the alleged barbarization of the Roman army, because this phenomenon had always been there, and it was mostly the Roman armies that Romanized rather than the other way around. You see, when there were all those units that were the scholar, there were the comitatenses, there was all properly also territoriality that is also revealed by the administrative, the increase of statal grip on the local administration and so on, to squeeze all the possible resources for having enough troops, and also in a qualitative sense. By the 6th century, just have a big empire that, however, hasn't quite reformed its own army, right? We don't talk about a Justinian reform of the military, right? That's Justinian reform, a big deal, but what you see by that point is essentially a big mess, right, in the neutral sense, of units that in part were descending from even the legions of the principality. Then all these various Constantinian type, say, units had been formed later. But there is no homogeneity in it. There are lots of mercenaries, right? Everything is put together almost on the spot, right? And therefore, in this melange, you find basically a complete hybrid of the various ethnic military traditions. And by the 6th century, what is important for the sake of cavalry in general is that basically whichever people you see around made an important use of cavalry, right? There is probably nobody from, I don't know, and we often underestimate it at some levels. We say, I don't know, the Norse or the Arabs, those peoples traditionally didn't have much of cavalry, but if you actually look at all the hints, all the info, you realize that thing, even if it was definitely present in different numbers, the best cavalrymen, in fact, as we were saying before, were the Huns, were the Moors, right? But there were very good cavalrymen all over Europe, for example, and the East, as you understand, the steppes and so on. So we're all kind of reviving mounted warfare, right? This is a passage that sometimes is missed when looking at this relatively obscure dimensional possibility of assessing the importance of cavalry on the field, starting from the late Roman, say, in early medieval times, because we don't have enough sources properly to offer a quantitative information, right? It would tell a lot. But in general, yes, you do see that not only the arm increased in importance, so mounted warfare altogether, but also that the quality of infantry was declining, right? In this picture, we rarely observe, for example, Roman cavalry ever dealing with like a strong infantry, right? This happened, I don't know, in theory the Romans had too somewhat, of a strong infantry their own way, the Germans too display these things, but the importance of cavalry was coming on the fore, right? We're still not at a point where cavalry was, let's say, decisive per se, right? Even the 6th century, even if it's a very transitional moment, it's not really, you can't really see it so openly, so much that even these peoples we mentioned, the Germans famously dismounted at some point, which is what we would expect to happen frequently, given the fact that cavalry also had probably some technical limitations, but also properly a feudal society didn't exist yet, as such. Reason for which peoples were more traditionally a question, like not the Berbers, the steppe peoples, and so on. Those were naturally prized. And Constantinople, in this sense, was a bit in the middle of it. They had the Persian from one side, the Huns from another. Even in Africa, they had the Berbers. And in other peoples, they were increasing their amount. So Constantinople, in its Pontic dimension, and also Near Eastern dimension, definitely is impacted dramatically in this phase by Eastern cultures in ways that you can't find even from a political, institutional, symbological point of view, right? And yet it's difficult to track properly light cavalry per se, because again, these were not really throwaway troops. On the contrary, especially in the Eastern Roman Empire, what you witness in part of the military transformations, we'll see now that the system had held together, because also the state, as a consequence of it, had managed, for example, to increase dramatically the amount of training for individuals, which is another thing that is often not realized, such as, for example, also the increase actually in technological capacities that occurred in late Roman times compared to previous time. People usually think, the major technological achievements of the Romans were in the time of the early empire. Actually not, right? At least they were in the measure in which they had the resources to invest in those things. But in the moment of crisis, you see in terms of qualitative technology, the effort to actually maximize certain capacities. Here, the Romans undergo in fact, a great deal of scientific, almost doctrinal reflection how it to be. The most famous work at this time is now naturally the Mauritius, Pseudo-Mauritius. So this work written in the imperial court. We don't know whether the author was the emperor itself, but it doesn't matter. It reflects the elite point of view, so the people who eventually led armies in battle. And not just all armies, because privatization was surely taking over, especially in the countryside. The Byzantine lords were starting to rise their own. Think about the Bucellari, think about this. Private forces that were in a sense local militias, right, that were capable, instead of maintaining a certain stability in spite of the mobile army, it was always something very bulky and very costly to move and to put together in the first place. So in these sources, we actually don't find mentioned light cavalry, which is strange, because you know that Mauritius is usually very detailed, right? And it is not until even the 10th century, which is normal in a sense because there is a big gap in between in terms of properly historiographical production, that light cavalry is covered in detail, right? And we will see this in other videos we already addressed, maybe not properly for Roman cavalry, but mirroring at that point the influence still of the steppes of the Asiatic light cavalry. Remember, we made a video recently about that, exactly for those early Middle Ages, full, advanced early Middle Ages. So when in these manuals, however, the Byzantine light cavalry does appear, right, they're so similar to later Roman times that we witnessed in our sources before, to suggest that they had remained there in spite of this lack of documentation, of course, more or less in the same numbers, even, and obviously with the same function, and for these authors not to feel the need to really write very much about them in the first place. Let's say in the campaigns, for example, Belisarius, if you read Procopius, etc., you understand that he was given only leftover troops for the expeditions, right? He had mostly to pay on his own, and the way the story is told is mostly almost heroic, where an individual knights almost rather than heavy cavalry are a bit central. There's this individualistic ethos that's taken over because armies have shrank also in size. They cost too much, right? In the 6th century, material poverty is something very, very, very evident, right? You see during the Gothic War, the horsemen needing wood for armor, right, rather than metal, because it was better than nothing, was there. And Mauritius, let's say, concentrates most on new troop types, new tactical, let's say, ideas, rather than about the units themselves, right? So describing in detail what this light cavalrymen really were. And if you think about it, there is not really a big deal of sense, because we already know more or less what light cavalry does, right? Most of the difference is rather with which equipment and what can that tell us, right? Surely there is an increase, for example, of horse archery, and that's kind of also obvious for the things that we were saying before. And so those would be also the main two typologies. There's nothing else. Mostly the javeliner and the horse archer, right? As we'll see, though, there is the impression that there's a sort of heavening of the same light cavalry as well, right? At least there is some kind of greater, let's say, care for equipment than it was before. Or better, from the side of those who actually fought, who took properly in their own hands the matters of equipping and supplying. And as we were saying before, this happens actually at an ever smaller scale, and an ever more private one, right? The principle that the soldier would have had to equip himself factually literally from a supply point of view, through some money the state paid, or never really come less, right? And in theory, not even the one properly of the idea that that money was to be restituted at some point. It wouldn't. This is a bit debatable, because of course we know that in some ways that it was not really like that. But even as we know, during the fabrics that were especially reinforced from the end of the 3rd century with Diocletian's reform, etc., were albeit obviously aimed at providing the good hardware, right? They were alien to the modern concept of uniformity, right? So even the ways naturally through which the soldiers equipped themselves were always somewhat personalized and customized. But later times, it's literally this thing also starts shrinking, right? Generals are always more kind of private people in a sense, so they pay themselves very often through their office. So in a way, was also the fate of those structural reforms of the 3rd to 4th century, because the empire had just halved right after the fall. It was a completely different situation, right? And the decline would start being felt. So we see that. But for this reason, what appears there to be is that if you have a smaller army, also consequently the enemies are in a way. The idea is that the individual importance increases, right? Not just from a not much for necessarily hand-to-hand, also for hand-to-hand combat, but properly in the sense that tactics themselves are ever less complex in a sense. Or even if they were, because they were, of course, complex in a sense, they were for smaller troops that could, in this sense, achieve more deeds. We have seen it in von Clausewitz, even with in negative odds, right, than what larger armies could do against one another, because essentially the difficulty to put them together is such that the capacity even of operating more complex, let's say, deeds on the battle are limited, right, to this bulk of the various lines that are massive, imposing. So in that sense, you have less probability, especially in condition numerical inferiority, to make it than in the smaller engagements, where actually parity of disparity, let's say, it's easier to win if you are 1 against 10 than if you are 1,000 against 10,000, right? Even if the proportion is the same, but actually the complexity of the group makes it more difficult to achieve more, right? And so, but in this sense, the individual quality, this in Procopius, this is well explained, right? All these stories of various horsemen that managed to achieve who knows what, these were mostly not heavy, they were not light cavalry most of the time. They were heavier troops. There's this proto-feudal ideal that is starting after all to emerge, also from these foreign cultures that the Romans drew their mercenaries from. But as a consequence, the light cavalry and the difference between heavy cavalry and light cavalry, in a sense, gets more blurred. Not much because of a necessity of a lightening of the heavier cavalry, but for a heavening, in relative terms, of light cavalry. And this means, in a sense, kind of a better equipment for, or at least the introduction of certain cavalry typologies that before didn't quite exist, and they were more suited for being kind of multitask in nature. Now, this is a long, this can be profitably debated, because again, if you saw how materially poor this cavalry was at the time, you would say, but you know, it doesn't seem as if it changed very much. Yes, but the worth of the individual has increased, right? And it's not really a positive thing, militarily wise, because certain infrastructure is still there. Look at the siege of Rome. Look at the general difficulties that the empire had to keep itself together, right? And so it's not really a compared to before. So this is particularly important also considering what the Constantinian reforms had been about, right? That is actually an increase in the tactical cooperation between the various arms that at this point have not have come less in the larger scale, right? And what happens now is that the complexity of tactics is mostly related to this very close interaction still between cavalry and infantry, but in a way that the gap between, let's say, the lighter troops and the heavier troops has somewhat decreased, right? And so you need for them to do things that look more like as if these peoples had literally been bred on horseback, like all these mercenaries of the steppes or the Berbers, etc. And literally sometimes they are the same people. In fact, then you know that rigid doctrinal systematization had occurred for larger armies in Constantinian time. So this is more or less the picture we're looking at. So there are some details relatively to, we could say, you know, how they were equipped, how they were not equipped. Like there were different types of equipment, of course. We could stereotype a bunch fundamentally. For example, the Trapezitas, the trick rider, right? Equipped, this is light cavalry, but he carries a Contarian, so a pretty long lance, 2 javelins, and a sword, and also relies for defense of protection on a 3 feet diameter round shield, right? And this type of cavalry, as you understand, does require, despite being light, a substantial level of training, because knowing how to operate with Contarian horseback, having also the necessity of covering yourself so much with such a large shield, reveals quite intense tactical situations, right? But also you have properly to charge, for example, as light cavalry, but you're also very much targeted by enemy missile, en masse. By the way, in fact, we start seeing even some armor for the shoulder, for example, cape of mail, or horn scales also were used, right? Maybe just for the superior part of the body, but the one that was to be more exposed, right? Of course, there were all types of armor. Now we're not stressing enough. Of course, we're talking about light cavalry, so at some point we will see the heavy one. It's another thing, but it's remarkable still that light cavalry here is increasingly provided with something that is normally heavier than the lighter cavalry, than the light cavalry average equipment, and which means naturally that these units were not just about the typical skirmishing role, as this guy exemplifies, right? Could have been equipped with javelins as well. They mostly were, right? So this interchangeability. What appears to be instead properly the missile trooper par excellence is the horse archer, as we were saying before, right? And the standard is so universal, right? Aside maybe from long butts that started appearing more frequently, also because again there were peoples from the steppes that brought, but properly it was the kind of employment on campaign operation that again put these troops sometimes in a more individually challenging situation, for which they had to be literally more involved than rather just in person, rather like a fighter, even at close range, rather than the older lighter types that were just maybe operating at the beginning of the battle. Then you send the heavy troops in, and then basically those are already spent. The light ones are already spent, and they either pull back, or they go on pillaging the enemy camp. But they're not, let's say, any more tactical part of the action, which is also an approximation, because of course it would always be there in some measure. It's just that the broader tactics would be more mediated and alternated. This instead remains like a single guy that also probably has as an archer to increase his own precision at some level, because again, fewer troops, in that sense precision increases. You know that in warfare, bows are used in a very different way from precision normally, right? You see, wherever it was made a large use, especially also by sedentary peoples. You see in the Middle Ages, the idea is like actually gunfire later on. I mean, it's concentrating the volleys, right? It's having this. It's not being precise. It's about being accurate. That is, you have to be synchronized to shoot all together on the enemy formation en masse, right? So that you can maximize in relative interest of time, the disorder of the formation, so that is more impacting than throwing the same exact amount of missile, but maybe in the same amount of time, but diluted all over the time rather than in one single volley. Well, this changes in a sense, because if you're a horse archer who has also this more close range tactical, hand-to-hand capability, you rely on that bow in ways that that kind of mediated combined armed tactics with various lines. It's not quite much there anymore, right? So this is a guy who is normally unarmored, if not, unless you consider maybe some form of padded clothing, something like that. Of course, there were armored horse archers in that sense, but they figured, and they start figuring, in fact, as a kind of troop typology more from the 5th to 6th century, probably because of Hunnic influence, because the Huns probably had, for the sake of protecting themselves from arrow fire in their warfare, they had at least a type of troop typology that was not just either the ultra heavy cavalrymen and the lots of completely unarmored horse archers, right? Especially in the western steppes, there is this kind of halfway where you have a light cavalry provided with some kind of heavier equipment. Especially a horse archer seems, in this sense, to be a bit of a Hunnic thing, and composite bows that are especially in the Eastern Roman Empire, but the very are widespread at this point because of the contact of all these peoples and of the steppes and hiring them and so on. Not only the steppes, also of the Middle East, of course, Near East, where this had been a thing since for a long time in the Roman army. And we can look at some passages from combat to get an idea of what especially skirmishing tactics were really about, right? So in the 5th century, as we've seen, we witness this important increase in cavalry warfare, right? So before that time, normally cavalry was really subordinated to infantry in everything, right? At this point, it starts coming on the foremost on equal ground, maybe surpassing it even in certain circumstances, right? And as a consequence, however, the main deal, of course, of light cavalry had been necessarily about missile fire, right? Even if they had to charge the enemy eventually, which is what theoretically every cavalryman can do, just because charging with a horse is already something imposing in itself. Doesn't matter whether you're suited like a type of cavalry or not, but it's an important thing. And in fact, in the Pseudo-Mauritius there is also some information about this, the necessity, not even maintaining a good order sometimes, but sometimes having more interest in timing, right, in being quick enough and to come en masse rather than orderly to surprise an enemy. It's playing with these tactics, right? So this gives you the idea of how, and it makes you understand also, considering the numbers involved, the units involved, that the interest of the Roman manualist was, in this sense, to stress also the importance of small unit tactics, right? So that they could be really, where as we were saying before, it wasn't much necessarily about the perfect tactical cooperations over the lines, where order at that point would have been before anything else, but most of this rapidity, this individuality at some point. And we start witnessing, in fact, in the 5th century, the increase of armor, even for those troops that still can be considered as light cavalry, that makes scouting, foraging, laying enemy territory to waste, and protect the flanks and rear of the column during the march, right? And they, of course, as always, lighter troops normally were used also to skirmish, to skirmish the enemy, to screen the army deployment before battle proper. Also hampering enemy deployment in turn, if they could succeed, protect the flanks of the infantry, defeat the same enemy cavalry, and very importantly, pursuing the routing opponents, which at that point light cavalry is really the best thing you can use. But they were not expected before this time, let's say, to really to charge, to charge infantry and to crush it. That was the infantry's task, right? We have a beautiful 3rd century account about cavalry in action from Zosimus, describing skirmishing tactics employed by Aurelian's cavalry against the Palmyrian cataphracts in 272 AD. You know that this is a bit the idea that we don't understand completely how it happened, but the Palmyrians had this important Persian influence, important cataphract tradition, and the Romans managed to take them out, even though they didn't have so many cataphracts, or maybe none even by themselves. So Zosimus says, so speed and maneuverability there, and also number was important. So he, that is Aurelian, ordered his cavalry not to engage immediately with the fresh cavalry of the Palmyrans, but to wait for their attack and pretend to flee, and to continue so doing until excessive heat and the weight of armor had so wearied men and horses that they had to give up the chase. This stratagem worked as the cavalry had adhered to the order of the emperor. When they saw their enemy tired and that the horses were scarcely able to stand under them or themselves to move, the Romans drew up the reins of their horses and wheeling around charged the enemy, trampling them as they fell from their horses. A confused slaughter ensued, some falling by the sword and others by their own and their enemies' horses. And then Zosimus goes on, and speaking also about infantry that was very compact, with shields close to each other and so on, and names also the Dalmatian and Moorish cavalry that would carry out the same light hit and run light cavalry tactics, albeit with less success this time, because he says, at the commencement of the engagement, the Roman cavalry made a partial withdrawal in case the Palmyrans, who outnumbered them and were better horsemen, should surround the Roman army unawares. But the Palmyran cavalry pursued them so fiercely, though their ranks were broken, that the outcome was quite contrary to the expectation of the Roman cavalry, for they were pursued by an enemy much superior in strength, and therefore most of them fell. The infantry had to bear the brunt of the action. Observing that the Palmyrans had broken their ranks when the cavalry commenced their pursuit, they wheeled about and attacked them while they were scattered in disarray. Right. So this is important, in fact, because you have essentially two episodes in which you realize how important it was for cavalry, yes, for light cavalry specifically, to attract the enemy in a trap, to wear them out. You really can't do it so simple. Here, Zosimus is approximating certain things. I mean, you can't just say, in a battlefield, okay, then no, I will simply exhaust these guys and then I take him over. Doesn't happen like that. Right? Aside from the second episode, where the thing was literally turning against the like, if you're escaping, literally you're not charging, which is another thing of cavalry that if you want an offensive use, you have to come back fighting, right? So either you lure the enemy cavalry in a trap where you can, I don't know, literally bring them in the mouth of infantry, other things like these. Well, in the sense of giving up ground, is, even if it were done just for let's say for a trick, for a feint, it does imply the fact that your cavalry is weaker, right? Because if you had superiority, you would have just charged them, right? And they would have been more easily annihilated in this sense. So here instead, you put yourself in a condition of inferiority, and especially about the first passage. It's combined arms tactics in that regard, but in the first passage especially, you must have enough room. You must have, like, if an enemy charges at you, you can't just retreat and hoping that the enemy just exhausts itself by itself, right? It depends on how extended the battlefield is, but normally a battle line is meant to advance. Yes, it can't be harassed by this light cavalry. In fact, it's never good for heavy cavalry to stand, or especially for the elite, or the one you want to deliver the heaviest blow with, under enemy skirmishers. It's like a waste, right? You normally send against those guys like the expandables, either light cavalry, or if you really don't have other troops, because this can happen. Maybe you're fighting against a line that is formed against, I don't know, only horse archers, like these guys with steps, and you have only kind of sedentary type of cavalry. Well, at that point, you shall send one line to kill itself, literally, or to at least, let's say, exhaust the enemy as well, because at that point, also missile cavalry by itself, as we've just said, it's not able to take out heavier cavalry by itself, right? So it's a draw. Right, you expand this, this medium cavalry that will disorder itself, that will be, wounded, tired, annoyed, exhausted, and nervous, but you will not kind of use it like that enemy line will not have the possibility of literally of charging ahead, because there are other heavier lines in the process, right? So what I mean is that you if you had also to cope with some kind of heavier cavalry, you, from one side, you would expand it against such skirmishers, but at the same time, those horse archers wouldn't have properly the capacity to maintain much ground in the first place, and probably that unit would maintain its own cohesion up until they meet even with the heavier lines later on. So at that point, that those archers, those missile troops should have either dispersed on the flanks or something. In fact, that's also what happened here. And the important is not to disorder, right? And consider that here we're not in times where cavalry had still in the 3rd century, so normally the upper hand. So it's always about infantry, and infantry is even tougher to harass in that way, because horses are vulnerable from missile fire and all these things, but infantry is there just almost conceived to take missile hits and to remain functional, right, to a certain degree. Doesn't matter how softened up it is before the charge, right, because you do need some strong cavalry for that. We also made a video about the Battle of Strasbourg, where we explained the whole battle, and Ammianus describes the battle like not a pitched battle, but a succession of quick skirmishes. You know what this battle was Julian against the Alemanni. It's one of the most famous battles in the 4th century, the most important ones, because basically the Romans halted the Alemannic invasion of Gaul there. And there were many of these things, including the Germans managing to defeat Roman cataphracts, essentially using their light cavalry and light infantry combined, right? So actually the Romans never had a great fortune with cataphracts in late antiquity, right? If you look at how they operated, they were obviously kind of copying this model they had found among the Persians, the Sarmatians, but they weren't quite able to replicate the ecosystem in a sense for which such cavalry could be nurtured. Sometimes they had people from those same places, but still in the 4th century infantry is somewhat superior, and still the cataphracts can be very, very heavy, cumbersome, right? It's infantry still that eventually succeed to win the battle. But the fact that there were these skirmishes around, it implies, of course, that it was kind of normal to harass the enemy also at distance with light cavalry. At Adrianople, too, there's an interesting passage from the same Ammianus who tells us, quote, "Our left wing penetrated as far as the Gothic wagons and would have gone further if it had received any support, but it was abandoned by the rest of the cavalry, and under pressure of numbers gave way and collapsed like a broken dike. This left the infantry unprotected," right? And yeah, so this naturally shows also a lack of coordination. We didn't know what would have happened. Adrianople was an example of really poor leadership, as a failure of the chain of command of some sort, not much of the lack of quality of the Roman units per se, and that's what makes it even more kind of clamorous in itself, because literally the Roman infantry fought to the death, even though they were surrounded, and so at that point normally would have broken in a city. Instead they stood their ground. Speaking of horses, which naturally can offer interesting perspectives on what this cavalry was concretely about, we have to obviously repeat was something that is actually widely known, but still that the Roman cavalryman's horse was smaller than modern horses, right? People in general were smaller, but let's say it would be, for a horse 130, 150 centimeters high. So even those very beefy mounts described as large, right, by various ancient authors, mostly were the Parthian, Sarmatian, Hunnish breeds, right? They rarely exceeded 155 centimeters. But this is true in general for even the Train medieval times. Were not really enormous animals as we think. It was. It's not much about the size of the beast in itself, but really its performance, its toughness, and not only, but in different ways. One thing is just being very muscular, like with large muscles can oxygenate for like this, mostly the stallions for the impact, for all these things. Surely not for light cavalry. Others for resilience, right? And resilience on a longer term, and for more of a strategical rather than a tactical need. That is, of course, these armies were very much on the move. They had to kind of go across very long distances and things like these. And so, although the army on the march would be accompanied by baggage wagons, of course, cavalry would often operate away from the main body. This is important. Consider that there have been studies on this, and like as we've seen also in the video about the Milanese mobile force of Gallienus, the Vexillationes, etc. The idea of increasing the number of cavalry is not really stemming much from a strategical mobility, right? Strategically speaking, at some point, especially in the longer run, infantry may actually be faster than cavalry, and especially considering that these march all together. Like the wagons are, like horses can really go for even 150 kilometers a day, right? But the fact is that this is an army, it's a wholly operating body, so the actual need for cavalry was tactical, right? That is, they needed it on the field, which naturally expresses by itself the increased importance in the quality of cavalry, at least in relative terms. And there were also kind of other reasons for the horse was loaded for the cavalrymen to be also self-sufficient in these circumstances, especially when they were marching ahead of the army around, where they could be attacked from one to another. They would have shields, javelin cases, water bottles, cooking utensils, right? Rations, of course, attached to the saddle. Cloaks also that had to be rolled up behind. These people lived under the weather, right? On horseback and so on. And so for this purpose, these mounts had to be not particularly fast or high-spirited, but they had to just endure more, right? For going across such distances with the rider with all this equipment together. So that would be the average thing. And naturally, the mount had to be reliable in combat at the same time. So of course it was a balance between the two things. And there are bits that could be extremely severe in this sense. So as always in war, well, what really triumphs really is what is good enough, not really the best, the top quality. Really, it's really what makes enough in consistent measure. And the slightest pressure on the reins would drive a plate into the roof of the horse's mouth, causing intense pain in that way. So these are things that wouldn't be allowed today, for example. But of course, if it were a matter of life and death for the soldier, well, these things have to be conceived. Think about the chaos of battle and so on. And also considering that the horseman is not just holding the reins, but literally the shield, the lance. So the horse has to be reliable, right? And it can't be a super expensive horse like so many that one in fact it would become for the heaviest cavalry on it, that would just obey to a simple hint of the rider. Like those were very prized ones, and of course skirmishers, the average cavalryman also in general wouldn't quite have it. The state could not afford it. Also the private means couldn't afford it in large numbers and so on. But properly from a tactical point of view, you would have at that point to spend so many horses. Like it would be even a waste, right? In a normal campaign where, of course, you know that you're going to lose so many troops just by attrition, desertion, illnesses and so on. So it's not necessary. The important is to have this very strong core, then surrounding it, protecting it, sheltering it with the lighter, expendable troops. There were also softer bits compared to the ones we said before, probably for the occasion when the horses were more obedient on their own. Of course, there were no stirrups by this time, and they would go by a well-constructed saddle, right, to essentially support, even given that they were also in organic material, were elastic enough, right? They had to operate with the muscular force and body movements. As we were saying before, in other videos, that was a bit the norm for many people who were literally grown up on horseback. Like the best stuntsmen would be, in fact, the Huns, the Berbers, etc. But at this point, that kind of skill was more widespread than is usually believed, right? Because we tend to attribute individual skill to advanced military cultures. Instead, it's completely the other way around. Like the more advanced the military culture, and the more it operates by collective training. That is to say, of course, the individuals have to be very, very, very well drilled, but you don't require them to do something extremely complicated, right? It's like musketeers during, the 18th century. They are intensely trained and very harshly so, but after all, they don't have not nearly as the individual skill in combat of a 6th century Germanic warrior. They don't, right? Or even a Byzantine Cavalarius. They don't. Why? Because of course the system is much broader. It operates along very different patterns. Those soldiers are not so expandable, but they make the wall in a collective, comprehensive fashion. So actually everybody at the time who had horses could make stunts on them, because literally the level of individual training was so very high, but the one of collective training, because of lack of centralized state, could give such a harsh collective discipline, and therefore creating a really qualitative professional army simply wasn't there. So never underestimate what can humans do on horseback in terms of all these stunts and so on, because there were peoples, again, that could do it literally. They lived by it. And the saddle started this period was built essentially around a wooden frame with 4 horns reinforced with bronze plates and then padded and covered with leather normally. And the horns held rider firm in saddle. And they were also useful for attaching equipment during the march and things like these. And in the 5th century, together with that increase in steps culture with steps hardware, as we've seen in the Roman army, we see in fact a new form of wooden frame saddle with kilted padding, right? That it was probably Hunnic in origin, and that would be adopted and remaining in use beyond even the end of this period. And as we were saying before, the stability of the horses were rarely shod at the start of this period, right? And for protecting the hooves, they were often kept off roads, right? So as we've seen before, screening the front, going cross-country, protecting flanks and rear of the column, could normally afford, right, for these horses to go on soft ground, whereas the infantrymen would go on the tracks, the roads, right? By the 6th century, it's not that the road network was particularly in standing, but still, those could create problems to the hooves, and it is a way for preserving naturally the horse's health in part. Naturally, still at this, albeit the heavy horseshoeing with nails and all these things, but would happen later. Also, when the breeds became to be larger, feudal culture required this greater force, and therefore, so that it was necessary to reinforce the shoeing. There were still horseshoes, and especially developing around this time in particular forms, or spreading at least in greater numbers. Albeit they were not really required, right? And conventional horseshoes were rare, at least prior to the 4th century, right? And so this is more or less the picture that we can draw, and as you understand, it's pretty vague because, again, we mostly lack evidence for lighter troops historically. Right, during the ancient world, medieval world, yes, we have an idea what it could be. If you have a good iconographic source of shows, then we say, oh, wow, we have an idea what it was, right? Even if we didn't have that iconographic source, because we know what skirmishers do in other times and places that are similar to, this pre-industrial societies. So it's not a mystery. It's just that this absence in itself provides you with the understanding of how of how relatively important these troops were individually per se, right? Of course, it was also sort of content. These were poor, cheaper troops. They were raised from the lower strata. There's already some kind of class, some status forming relatively to the heavily armored horseman, what would become a knight properly at some point. And still, there were actual knights at this point as well. Think about the Alans. Think about this heavier, hardcore, scale, completely covered in scale, heavy cavalry from the hardcore steppes, military cultures. But in order to see that, you have to understand how the system is evolving. And what do we see in late Roman cavalry, if you want early Byzantine one, is such, especially up to the 6th century, such which is typically Byzantine in nature, because the Roman, like in the previous time, it hadn't quite happened, right? It's this, given the crisis I was saying before, the increasing quality of the individual trooper, right? For equipment, for training, yeah, that costed a lot, but it was better maybe to create one guy like that than three that didn't have really that, so that you could rely more on that for the new strategical and tactical needs that were present, right? So for many reasons, also because probably it was an economical convenience, just if you make the mathematics of the sum, but also probably demographic resources, since from quite a while now had become dramatically precious. So literally man's life was important, paradoxically more in a period where it was in practice would be more expandable, but still in turn, for the sake of training and for war preparation, there was in relative terms a greater interest in these guys' capacities individually than before, right? So this is pretty much it. And for now, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.